Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt, and I'm glad to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. Remember, we do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. To check the specifics of upcoming topics and speakers, please go to securefreedom.org and check under the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today's program is our monthly China-focused program entitled China's Quest for Space Hegemony, featuring our special guests, Rick Fisher and Michael Listner. Before proper introductions, let me remind you that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box in your GoToWebinar panel, and I will read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. On to our guests. Michael Listner is an attorney and the founder and principal of Space Law and Policy Solutions, a think tank and consultation firm that concentrates on legal and policy matters on outer space law and policy as it relates to national security, geopolitics, industry, and development. Michael is a recognized authority in outer space law and policy and has authored over 100 articles related to the topic. Michael obtained a Bachelor of Science in Computer Information Systems from Franklin Pierce University, his Juris Doctorate from Regent University School of Law. Michael has been a member of the New Hampshire Bar in good standing since 2003 and is the author of The Précis, which is a subscription quarterly briefing letter relating to outer space law, policy, and geopolitics. Thank you so much for joining us. Rick Fisher is a senior fellow on Asian military affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Fisher is a recognized authority on the People's Republic of China military and the Asian military balance and their implications for Asia and the United States. His most recent book is China's Military Modernization, Building for Regional and Global Reach. Fisher has worked on Asian security matters for over 20 years in a range of critical positions as Asian Studies Director at the Heritage Foundation, Senior Analyst for Chairman Chris Cox's Policy Committee, and a consultant on PLA issues for the congressionally chartered U.S.-China Security and Economic Review Commission. The author of nearly 200 studies on challenges to American security, economic, and foreign policy in Asia. Fisher studied at Georgetown University and Eisenhower College, where he received his BA with honors. He is currently president of Pacific Strategies, Inc. Rick, welcome, and let's start with you. Last fall, the Pentagon released a report that said, quote, China already has operational ground-based missiles that can hit satellites in low Earth orbit, and, quote, probably intends to pursue additional anti-satellite weapons capable of destroying satellites up to geosynchronous Earth orbit. Could you discuss the growing threat of ASAT weapons?
Yes, Adam, thank you. And thank you and the Center for Security Policy for having me with your Wednesday session. China has had essentially a low Earth orbit ASAT capability since 2009 or 2010. They've been working toward that goal since the early 1990s. And with the development of larger solid fuel space launch vehicles, primarily out of both the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, CASC, and China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, or CASIC, they have had the ability to intercept targets in medium and geosynchronous orbits. I would say since about 2015, they have had organized units subordinate to the new. Well, they have a space force that has been subordinate to the Central Military Commission's armaments department for most of the last decade, but this switched to the new. Escapes me now, but it's been a part of the PLA order of battle for at least half a decade. The units have missiles. The missiles are placed on transporter erector launch vehicles and they may look like ICBM units, but they are in fact ASAT units.
Well, obviously a serious and developing threat, and one of the reasons why the Trump administration took space threats very seriously. So to turn to you, Michael, actually the Biden administration surprised many in Washington when it did not reverse President Trump's decision to create a space force, although many mocked it at the time. Can you discuss the reasons for the creation of the Space Force and how it's intended to protect our security in space, especially concerning China?
Well, thank you for having me. Just to start right off, I mean, there's been a lot of media hype about whether the new President Biden would get rid of the current Space Force, and people don't understand that this is actually law now. It's actually ingrained in Title 10, and the president doesn't have the authority to arbitrarily say, I don't want it anymore. He's got to basically, Congress has to go in and basically uncreate it, so to speak. So fundamentally, the whole idea of Space Force, this has been something that's been a long time in coming, something I wanted, because the Air Force has been really taking on the role of outer space. It's really a step in the right direction. During the Trump administration, we made the policy decision to declare space warfighter's domain, and really delineate it from airspace and the other domains, including cyber. So fundamentally, this was an evolutionary step. It did get a lot of criticism from the Chinese, even though the Chinese have adopted a similar structure that encompasses both their space forces and their cyber forces. And the Russian Federation has had something similar in the works as well. However, they've been using the media quite fruitfully to mock and denigrate it. So fundamentally, this is a natural step. I think it all depends, how far it progresses depends on how well it's funded and what Congress decides to do with its funding. So really, the ball is out of the president's court at this point, and it's in the hands of Congress as to how the Space Force progresses from here on.
Adam, if I could add something.
Absolutely.
The Strategic Support Force is the new organization of the People's Liberation Army that hosts the Chinese Space Force as it is. And I would also add that starting on April 29 of this month, China will start launching segments of its new large space station. And eventually, the space station, in my opinion, will be a dual-use platform. It will have the ability to incorporate military modules as well as industrial or experimental science modules to conduct actual warfare in outer space from a manned platform. This is also why we need a space force. And in addition, China has just started testing reusable space planes, and those can be expected to get larger and will be armed as well.
Well, actually, to continue further out into space, I was struck by, in a piece you wrote for the center, how central the moon was as a focus, from hosting potential military bases to providing resources, of course, that could make China energy independent, to serving as what you call the ultimate spy satellite. Can you give us a drill down on the moon, basically as a case study of what's at stake?
Certainly. China requires control of the Earth-Moon system in order to really achieve its ambitions for political, military, and economic hegemony on Earth. The moon, in the first round, will become the new high ground. The moon is the ultimate satellite. The Chinese have been quite open, actually, in how they're going to go to the moon, and especially how rapidly they might populate the moon. And to illustrate this last point of rapidity, I'd like to go to a slide, and that could be a complicated procedure here, but let me just do this, and Adam, tell me if we're okay with the slide.
Yep, you're up. Perfect.
Okay. In this slide, I illustrate China's investment in space launch vehicles. The United States, for most of the last decade, has been trying to develop a kind of Saturn V capable space launch system, we call it, just the SLS. We also have the innovative private sector initiative of Elon Musk and his SpaceX corporation that is now actively developing his Starship, which is the progress for which is quite readily available on YouTube. Now, China, about a decade ago, revealed that it was developing a new space launch vehicle called the Long March 9. And that's on the left side of the slide here. And it's a space launch vehicle that is a bit more capable than the SLS. Eventually, it will be able to transport about 65 tons to the moon, although there are Chinese sources that suggest the low Earth orbit launch lofting capability could leap from about 140 tons to 200 tons, which means that the tonnage that it can take to the moon could rise to the 70 to 80 ton level. Now, little had been revealed about this Long March 9 over the last 8 or 9 years. There have been snippets, the occasional PowerPoint slide or press image, but we really didn't know how much progress the Chinese were making in this space launch vehicle. But starting at about 2018, the Chinese revealed that they were making a second space launch vehicle. The Long March 9 had always been advertised as being available starting in about 2030. But the 2018 revelation of the 921 rocket, which is in the middle picture of the slide on the left. The 921 rocket only promises to be able to push about 25, 26 tons to the moon. So, less than half the expected capability of the Long March 9. But because the 9.2 rocket was going to be based on then existing technology, the alarm went out. China could develop this space launch vehicle much sooner. And this space launch vehicle could support an earlier, albeit much more lightweight attempt to put people on the moon. Chinese sources say that the 9.2 rocket could begin testing in 2024, 2025, and we should expect that it will be able to accomplish a circumlunar mission, or two of these could put people on the moon in the 26 to 27 time frame. And then an article appeared in late November 2020, a China Daily article that quoted a CASC official stating that between 2030 and 2035, China could build up to 60 of their Long March 9 space launch vehicles. So this is very significant, because if you simply look at the weight of the Chinese space station module that's going to go up at the end of this month, approximate that as what would be the weight of a long-term habitat module that you would put on the moon, it works out that about 40 of the Long March 9s could loft the sufficient habitat plus equipment to equip 10 moon bases. So we could see, possibly, from 2030 onward, a Chinese blitz to build these moon bases as rapidly as possible so that China can be the first to occupy the most likely locations on the southern pole of the moon that would contain ice water and other very valuable resources that would enable China to begin to set up factories on the moon to build things like very large solar power gathering satellites that have the potential of making China energy independent from Earth-based oil resources, or you could just steer these satellites over a client country and supply their energy. In addition, China is making solid fuel space launch vehicles by CASIC, which one of which could have about the same capability as the 921 rocket. A second slide, if it comes up here. Well, yeah, I'm not. Okay, well, just briefly, a second and third slide may not be possible, but what they would contain are images of at least 2 Chinese mobile moon landers images that have been released from Chinese conferences or journal magazines. And also China may be working on lightweight moon landing vehicles that would be more appropriate to the 921 rocket. And a third slide would show that China is also very interested in a gateway type small space station to go around the moon and better assist the transport of people and material to the moon. And also China is looking at putting satellites around the moon that would assist in navigation, in observation, and both of those kinds of satellites could also be used to target weapons, either on board a circling small space station or placed on the moon for direct use. And so this all illustrates the level of Chinese potential investment in taking control of the moon, taking control of the choicest locations for resources, and the potential that China has for turning many systems into dual use systems, being able to perform both scientific, industrial, and military missions. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you for a tour of probably the central, let's say, venue in the economic or resource realm, as well as important to the defense side as well. But before we explore that a little bit more, let's just return, Michael, briefly to maybe the technical side of the anti-satellite weapons, as far as physically how do they work, and at the moment, what can the U.S. do, if anything, to defend its satellites?
Well, right now the U.S. is relying. Well, any defenses or any countermeasures they have are classified for obvious reasons. You don't want to show all your cards, but there have been comments made by military officials that we have the ability to defend our satellites, and of course, there's this concept of resilience, meaning and I've always coined resilience as being able to take a punch and still get up. Not a fan of it. I mean, I've always thought that the idea of resilience is great, but if you're going to keep on taking punches, you're eventually not going to be able to take punches, and at some point you got to punch back. So, any countermeasures, any technical abilities to actually defend against an actual ASAT incursion, whether it be a soft kill or a hard kill ASAT, obviously they remain in the classified realm, and rightly so.
Well, I would add, Adam, that Michael's mention of resilience is spot on. I mean, you look at what Elon Musk is doing with his Starlink constellation. Over 1,200, some reports up to 42,000 or 12,000, and then 42,000 low Earth orbit satellites. as a new global broadband linkage. If our military had an exclusive channel, it would take the Chinese a long time to take down all of those Starlink satellites. So it exists as a potential fantastic expansion of American space resilience, as Michael mentions.
Well, and I'll add to that I'll add back onto that is the whole, and I actually had this discussion with somebody who shall not be named. The idea of being able to take a punch is great, but what if you take one big knockout punch? We tend to forget sometimes that our counterparts in China don't think the same way we do. They think a lot differently than Westerners, and sometimes we get caught in Western mentality thinking, well, we can defend against the system by, building up redundancies. On the other hand, if your adversary decides that I'm going to account for those redundancies by taking them all out at once or hitting key points in that system, you've basically nullified any advantage you had in numbers or resiliency.
Yes, I would agree. The resiliency goal does have vulnerabilities. For example, the Chinese have invested a great deal of effort in building a presence on the South Pole, and they are pushing very hard to do the same on the North Pole. It happens that a satellite in a polar Earth orbit comes closest to the Earth at the North and South Poles. About 4 or 5 years ago, the Chinese advertised that they were conducting atmospheric experiments with a ground-based laser from the South Pole. Ha ha ha. Everything that the Chinese do is for a dual-use purpose. So we can probably speculate that the Chinese have lasers on the South Pole that are pretty well capable of at least dazzling very low-flying satellites that go over the South Pole, which would be the majority of satellites designed for either military or civilian Earth surveillance.
Well, speaking of taking out capabilities all at once, maybe to turn a little off of China directly, but related, of course, North Korea, as far as perhaps asymmetrical means, as they have launched several satellites over the past 10 years. What do you think about the realistic threat of EMP attacks regarding the U.S. power grid, or just other asymmetrical attacks from North Korea? And either of you could start.
Well, I think the idea of asymmetric warfare is going to be a given, whether it's North Korea or the People's Republic of China. It's not going to be a fight by traditional means, and it's going to be waged on all fronts. I mean, I always tell people, I think really right now we're in the midst of a war, or a war that's basically setting up a future battlefield in terms of legal, political, psychological. With the North Koreans, who knows? I mean, again, I'm not privy to the intelligence, and neither should I be, because it's none of my business. But the idea is you always hit at a weak point. It always all go back to the teachings of Sun Tzu, which Eastern governments and education basically really focus on a lot, while the Westerners are more into Clausewitz and general warfare that way. So can EMP? It's a possibility. Whether or not they have the technical capability to do it is another thing.
Sure. What if the North Koreans decided to conduct an atmospheric nuclear test in the middle of the Pacific, much as the Chinese did that for their first H-bomb test, I believe, launched off of a missile. If the North Koreans missiled a bomb out to the middle of the Pacific and we did nothing, we did not respond in some kind of symmetric manner, then the North Koreans might believe that, we could do an H-bomb test off of Seattle and take out the American electronic kit in our major SSBN base. So yes, the North Koreans have lots of asymmetric options.
Let's turn, because I think, Michael, you were referring to there with the psychological, political, and media, something that we chatted about before the program, the three warfares, which is a let's say unconventional or non-kinetic way of waging war that the Chinese are good at. So let's go into your expertise, as far as international law and treaties. Have they been able to abuse that? I mean, has that been at all effective? And maybe some examples where China and the US, or maybe even Russia, some precedent for where treaty and international law has been effective or ineffective.
Well, I mean, bottom line is treaties are really a plaything. I mean, I also do litigation practice here in a domestic sense, and I always look at the law and the rules as a tool, as a weapon to use when to advocate my client's case. So fundamentally, is the rules, the way both the PRC and the Russian Federation look at it is these are weapons of war. And really, but the bottom line it comes down to is the PLA in particular has it is actual doctrine that if there is a strategic advantage to ignoring an international norm or a rule or a treaty to gain that advantage over an adversary, do it. So I mean, and this all goes back to the idea: is the world a Lockean? In other words, we have a rule of law type of world, or Hobbesian, where basically it's law of the jungle. And I've always thought that it's a little bit of both, although now moreover it's kind of leaning towards Hobbesian. And the point I try to make with people is that when you go into a war, especially when you get into a conflict with the People's Republic of China or the Russian Federation for that matter, you can't rely on them always following the rules. They may ignore the rules while at the same time hitting you to follow the rules. So it's kind of a catch-22, and it's something that I've seen the PRC use it a lot. I mean, well, South China Sea. Well, let's go back to the South China Sea. The PRC is ratified the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, and basically it says you can't make any sovereign claims in what is open ocean. Yet we have them here building these islands all the time, claiming that they are entitled under UNCLOS to do it. There was an arbitration case at The Hague a few years ago with the Philippines, and they lost. Basically, the Philippines had, the Hague said, China doesn't have the right to build these islands. And this is where the other aspects of the three warfares, psychological and political, come in. They basically the PRC used their political leverage to basically squash down any blowback from European countries and even the United States. The response to them basically ignoring the arbitration decision was pretty muted. So understand, they are very masterful at this. They know how to use the law, the politics, and the media to basically set the battlefield so that they'll have an advantage.
So obviously these asymmetrical means are necessary for them because they presumably are still behind us on other factors of power. But I'm curious to get both of your view, and we'll start with Rick on something, a sort of scary thought, but experts are saying that if Taiwan were to fall, that would sort of be the breaking point, let's say on Earth, the breaking point, as far as China becoming a great power and possibly superseding us, or at least taking control in the Pacific. Do you see a breaking point in space? And considering the stakes and what you're describing, that many people don't quite get the stakes, is there something with the moon or something with defense where we'd reach that breaking point? And let's start with Rick.
Yes, Adam. I would also offer that there is a very direct relationship between the power balance on Earth and the power balance in space. For China to conquer Taiwan, and in my opinion, this would actually mark the beginning of China's active military quest for global hegemony. They would militarize the island and use it to project power globally, and we would be forced into decades of wars with China, even in the Western Hemisphere. But that said, if China were to conquer Taiwan, it would use that victory to lord over the United States, to try to convince the rest of the world that it is the dominant power and that you must cooperate with China on the moon and beyond in order to have anything that you think you want from outer space, especially the benefits of the future space economy. But in regards to tipping points on the moon itself, I would highlight the possibility of the Chinese Long March 9 fed moon blitz that could start in the early 2030s to wrap up all of the choice locations on the south pole of the moon potentially before the United States could do the same with its allies, which is why it is so critically important that the Biden administration continue funding of our Artemis program to get us back on the moon before the Chinese, and to incorporate much more capable potential commercial capabilities to populate the moon. Okay, I'll stop there.
And Michael, whether you see it as related to the moon or just other factors, do you see a point of no return or tipping point as far as Chinese power in space?
I'm careful about terms like tipping points and such, because with the PRC is a very worthy adversary. They're very shrewd. They take advantage of opportunities, even bad opportunities. I mean, during COVID-19, a problem that arguably they created for the world, they've taken advantage of that geopolitically in many ways. One thing really struck back in December, they sent a lunar return sample mission to the moon and launched it back successfully. And right after the return module left, the descent module raised a Chinese flag. And this is on December 4th, and I actually had to give another presentation that same day, and I looked at that, and my question was, okay, what does this mean? Or what's the significance of this? Now, people will say, oh, well, the Americans put flags on the moon when they landed on the moon. That's different, because when, for example, before Pete Conrad and Alan Bean actually stepped on the moon, actually when they were on transit to the moon for Apollo 12, Congress passed a NASA Authorization Act, and within that act, they put a provision that the placement of the U.S. flag on the moon or any other celestial body is not an act of sovereignty, but just basically an expression of national pride. Just a few years earlier, we became party to this treaty called the Outer Space Treaty. That really was a big negotiation, for the most part, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And one of the things in that treaty basically says no nation shall claim sovereignty. If you want to think about it, you can think of outer space roughly in terms of Antarctica, because the Outer Space Treaty is kind of loosely based on the Antarctic Treaty. So what Congress was worried about, since these flags really weren't in the mission plan to begin with, they didn't want the impression that the U.S. was going and claiming territory by planting the flags. Now, back to the Chinese flag. What does it mean? Well, I really don't, you know what, I have a few opinions. I won't express them here, but I'll put the question out to you and your audience. But I think it's a signal that, eventually this could mean other things. For example, in the South China Sea, they use flags to denote their sovereign territory within otherwise areas that are considered, the open ocean and free access. So to get back to your question, is there going to be a tipping point? No, I don't think there's going to be a tipping point. I think there's going to be a gradual erosion, and all of a sudden we're going to be, oh my God, we're there. What happened? And again, that gets back, and like I said, I have a lot of respect for our Chinese adversaries. They're very smart, they're very shrewd, and they do take advantage of opportunities when they arise.
Excellent. Let's change gears just slightly, and I forget who brought up Elon Musk, but he was mentioned. And so let's talk about the fact China arguably holds a strong advantage if there's a new space race as a dictatorship, because they don't have the same political or funding constraints that we do. And it's received wisdom that our free market helped us in the Cold War and other periods of international competition, but will our private sector be able to contend with the Chinese advancements, or might stronger government direction or incentives be required? Let's start with Rick.
Well, we need both. In the event the private sector falters, we have to have fallbacks to government-owned and developed capabilities. But right now, in SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other private sector space companies that have arisen in the United States, are soon to arise in Europe, and are certainly capable of arising in places like Taiwan, and other Asian countries, we should do all that we can to encourage these private sector companies to succeed in developing capabilities that assist the achievement of our national goals. And here, Elon Musk is one of the leaders. If his Starship actually comes to work in the next couple of years, this is a capability that promises to put 100 tons of people and cargo on the moon, to be capable of reaching Mars with significant payloads. This one capability could allow us to leap ahead of China in the race to populate the moon and Mars fantastically. And we are very lucky to have this potential tool at our reach. So it's important that we do, as a government, provide some kind of initial market to help Musk or Blue Origin to develop these capabilities that assist our own national security objectives.
And Michael, your thoughts on?
Well, I would push back against the supposition that commercial space could fail, because I think the die is cast right now, and we're moving in a direction where commercial space is very entrenched. I mean, when you get to the point where the military has ceased owning a capability and instead is going to contract to a capability, that represents a very important industry, and you're not going to kill that. And of course there's a lot of politics involved. These operators, Musk, Bezos, they're very shrewd, they're very clever in their lobbying and getting support in Washington for these programs. So I think right now we're kind of set on a course, and really I think it's our secret weapon. We talk about China's commercial program. Well, China really doesn't have any true commercial industry, because any commercial industry also has some state ownership. So I think commercial is here to stay. Of course, we got to support it, and that means not getting in its way too much through regulation or other things that are going to limit it.
So we actually have a lot of solid questions. So I think why don't we move over to questions a little bit early here. What's to prevent any private sector company from selling itself to China for the right price?
Export laws.
And you feel those will be faithfully or effectively executed?
If they have lucrative government contracts, they'll toe the line, and they'll definitely not squander that type of thing. I mean, I know Musk in particular was always, from what I understand, he doesn't patent any of his rocket technology. He trademarks it, because when you patent something, it gets into the public domain, and from that point, it's fair game for China's intellectual property espionage.
There is something to mention about Musk, though. Several years ago, when he started advertising the Starship and advertising the ability of the Starship to be a passenger transport, potentially allowing passengers to reach the other side of the globe in 40 minutes, he advertised this. He advertised one destination for the Starship as being in China. That certainly raised an alarm with me. As a nation, we would lose tremendously if the Chinese were to capture, exploit, spy on a Starship level of technology and use that to accelerate their own reusable, very heavy launch vehicle technology. So my hope is that Mr. Musk has adjusted his goals for this service. Perhaps, let's say, put up a landing and launch center in Taiwan, and then let people travel from Taiwan into mainland China if they must. But having this service land in China it presents the kind of conflicts that need to be settled very early on by export regulations.
And to get back to that, I think from a actual regulatory standpoint, and a permissiveness of the U.S. The U.S. really doesn't have too much competition around the world. There are that outer space treaty that I mentioned before basically permits outer space activities by private individuals, but states are always responsible for those activities, so they have the final say of whether they happen. Ever since the Reagan administration, when really that kicked off the idea of commercial space, we have basically had a very permissive. It's been kind of burdensome, but they've actually worked on that. I know the FAA back on March 21st just enacted what they call streamlined rules for reentry license for launch and reentry licensing for a spacecraft. I mean, there's always going to be some sort of regulation because of international obligations. But right now, in my opinion, the U.S. is the best one. And I always say, and when people say, well, they could go to other countries that are less burdensome. And when things hit the when things get rocky, when you get a lot of trouble, you want the U.S. on your side because we have the political clout in the world. Versus, a smaller country that may have less regulation, but if it comes to defending your business or defending your right to do this, you want somebody who has a lot of geopolitical muscle, and the U.S. has geopolitical muscle and the permissiveness to perform these activities.
I would add to that, though, that we must pay attention to the technology policy loops that follow each other. China is investing heavily in reusable space launch technologies and systems. It is quite possible that by the early to mid 2030s, they could have reusable space launch vehicles comparable to the Starship. So we can try to regulate that with laws and maybe even treaties or agreements between the democratic allies to sort of contain the Chinese capability. But in reality, in my opinion, the better antidote would be to come up with the next best mousetrap, the next better reusable space launch system, or perhaps to invest heavily in nuclear space propulsion to make it even less expensive to go from Earth orbit to the Moon and Mars.
Let's move to the next question. Current space spending, both total and military, is less than half of what it was during the latter part of the Cold War. Military space is 1/3 of what it was pre-sequestration as a percentage of the federal budget. What is an appropriate level of resourcing for NASA and the Space Force to compete?
Sure.
Boy, that's a tough one. I don't follow budgets as closely as I do systems and technologies, but it is actually, for me, pleasantly surprising that the Biden administration has just committed to a level of NASA funding for the next fiscal year that appears to take into account the cost of the Artemis program. Last September, under the Trump administration, NASA released a figure that we require $28 billion for Artemis to succeed in putting people on the moon. The current Biden request for the NASA budget would appear to cover the first 1/5 of what would be required to meet the 2024 deadline set under the Trump administration to put people back on the moon. So that's encouraging, but I simply hope that it can be sustained, given the vast social, economic, social, and social engineering priorities of the administration. One wonders how quickly they will be going to defense and going to NASA to make up those differences.
And I don't have any comment. I'm unsure what budgets. I don't have enough internal knowledge what was going on, and anything that I might become privy to would probably be confidential anyways.
Got it. Would China use a nuclear weapon for ASAT purposes?
Well, that's a good question. China, I talked about the Outer Space Treaty. China had no part in negotiating it, but they decided to join in 1983. And there is this one provision in what we call Article 4, which is the no bombs provision, which basically says we're not going to operate nuclear weapons in outer space. This actually put a kink in the Reagan administration's SDI program that wanted to use the X-ray laser system. Would they use one? Well, according to the treaty, they're not permitted to. But again, when basically when you get into a war conflict situation, if they felt the need to do it, and if it would benefit themselves strategically, they might.
Certainly, I would agree with that.
Are you concerned about both PRC and Russian ambitions for in-space nuclear-powered vehicles? What sort of emphasis and which agency should respond?
Rick?
Well, yes, we should. Both the Chinese and the Russians have their own nuclear space power programs. About 3 years ago, I believe, there were suggestions from the Russian media that the Russian nuclear power space program was the subject of or a target for Chinese espionage. A prominent space engineer was arrested. It's not clear whether this individual was actually caught trying to sell nuclear space propulsion technology, although he certainly knew enough about it to qualify being a Chinese target. But that said, the Russians are actually building a prototype of a nuclear-powered space platform, and I would expect that the Chinese will emerge with something later in this decade. So the urgency that has developed on the American side over the last year or two to up our investments in nuclear space power propulsion are more than justified.
And I take, whenever the Russian Federation makes an announcement through one of their state media outlets, I always take it with a huge grain of salt. My biggest thing is, okay, who's going to pay for it? Russian Federation is, there's been a lot of emphasis and focus on them as an adversary. A former congressman just the other night was saying that she fears a conflict with the Russian Federation. There's always somebody you have to watch, but I think our primary problem is China, because they have the financial resources, they have the technical know-how or the ability to gain it, and I think if anything in terms of nuclear, I think the Chinese would probably get there first. Again, the Russians, when you see these grand plans, my big question is to say, oh, who's going to pay for it? And until they can show an ability to pay for it, I take it with a big grain of salt.
Well, I agree in the main with Michael. The Russian space sector for the last 20 years has been very, very adept at producing PowerPoint plans for separating from the International Space Station, building their own space stations, and big programs like their own super heavy space launch vehicle have come to naught, primarily because they don't have the money. The key here would be to see who ends up manipulating who in the emerging Russian-Chinese space axis. They've just signed a memorandum to cooperate in building an unmanned base on the moon. The Russians, in just the last day, have come up with a budget that promises to fund their next 3 unmanned moon probes that would also contribute to this unmanned Sino-Russian moon base. The key here would be whether the Russians are able to manipulate the Chinese into funding their high technology projects, or whether the Chinese are successful in manipulating the Russians into turning over their technology for the cheapest price, so that the Chinese gain the ultimate advantages. China wants Russia to be a client. Russia wants to be a leader, an equal to China and the United States. And that's really the fundamental rub between them. And we're not yet clear on how this is going to work out.
Well, and I guess just to add on to that, people fret over the Russian-Chinese collaboration, and my point is, this is fine. Right now, they're working together because they have a common adversary, us, the U.S., the West. But they're natural enemies, and eventually they're eyeing each other while smiling for the cameras all this time. And at some point, they're going to turn on each other. So I always kind of assuage people's concerns with that rudimentary comment.
I agree entirely. The Russian strategy with China is to do everything they can so that the Chinese eat them last.
Let's throw this one to Rick. Is a legal regimen being developed for moon development?
I think one already exists. Michael might be able to talk about that more than I can.
Actually, there is one that was actually created in 1980. I think it's called the Moon Agreement. Dead on arrival. It has all the numbers it needs for all the numbers of signatories it needs for ratification, and it has been quote international law for a long time. But none of the big three, U.S., Russian Federation, or China, have signed on to it. It's dead. There's been actually there's been efforts to actually revive the Moon Agreement and give us some legitimacy, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And then I guess the competing areas that is space resources, which the United States introduced in 2015 and is really pushed in starting in 2020. There's another group called Moon Village, which has actually put together a group of experts to come up with this set of guidelines and principles that it wants to present to the UN. So my comment to people is, I'm not really looking at a written treaty so much as I'm worried about or concerned about customary international law, which is law that's created through action and accepted as legally binding. Could go into a long dissertation about customary international law and why I think it's sneaky and very, very stealthy. But suffice it to say, I think more efforts to build these principles, to build these legally binding regimes will be found in customary international law versus any formal treaties.
Michael, what do you think about the future of the Artemis Accords? Could they provide a basis for something that could become either more solid politically or even legally?
Well, I think they're solid politically in that the Accords already have a number of signatories, including some of the lesser developed nations, and I think even Brazil is going to sign the Accords. So I think it was very shrewd on the part of the Trump administration to get these people on board and actually get these agreements signed before it went out of office. Is it going to become something? Well, it is already something. I've always looked at the Aerospace Treaty as a framework document. It's very loose. It's very vague and allows for a lot of play in most respects. I refer to it as saltwater taffy because basically you can mold it interpret it into whatever you want. The idea of the Artemis Accords is to build onto that framework. So look at the Outer Space Treaty as a solid foundation and the Artemis Accords as the beginning of a framework. Now, the idea of the Artemis Accords as these aren't an end all, there's actually, the idea is the countries or states that sign onto the Artemis Accords, well, as we go down the road and start performing some of these activities, we might say, you know what, we're actually getting into other areas that we don't have agreements on how we're going to behave. Let's get together and actually do an agreement. Now, the neat thing about the Artemis Accords, it's outside the UN. This was done on the United States initiative outside of the UN. I read a national security document that the Biden administration published a few months ago that basically says it wants, that in my opinion says it wants to get back into the UN. And I always said the UN is a playground of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China just because of the soft power they wield there in the different areas of it. So I don't know where it's going. I know there's been talk of I think it was the Atlantic, the document was released on Tuesday the 12th, which basically from the Atlantic Commission or the Atlantic Council that basically says we need a new treaty to supplant the Outer Space Treaty. Where that's going to go, I don't know. Will it happen? I don't know if there's a political will to do it. But personally, I think that would be the wrong way to go down. But again, that's just my personal opinion.
Let's have, we just have one more question. So the questioner asks, can you speak to deterrence in the space domain? But maybe let's narrow it down a little bit. You know, we've talked about the different weapon systems a bit and how they counteract each other. But let's say something like mutually assured destruction, or what we used to have in the Cold War. Is that kind of thing possible with a regime like China, and is that applicable to space? Is it going to reach some kind of arrangement like that?
Want to start, Rick?
Yeah, well, the key here is to pay attention to the progression of dual-use systems. mean, eventually the Chinese are going to bring mining equipment to the moon. What if this is basically high power laser based? If you have megawatt class lasers on the moon to drill out iron ore or titanium, you have a weapon that's going to be able to deal heavily with satellites going around the moon, and if you can transport that mining device to other locations, you have moon artillery. The Chinese are already telling us that they're investing in mobile small habitats. The slide that I tried to put up has an image of a very small habitat that could probably carry 4 people, but it has wheels in the first analysis, and also rockets on the side that would allow it to leap from one location to a medium or distant other location on the moon. So even a small 10 kilowatt or 20 kilowatt laser on top of something like that would constitute a decisive weapon in the very near term. So we have to keep an eye on these potential dual use evolutions of the Chinese kit on the moon, and be ready to match it as soon as possible.
Well, I take the view of, when we talk about deterrence, we got to. I mentioned earlier, we can't, we think like Westerners with deterrence of mutually assured destruction, but China isn't like that. The PLA in particular views deterrent. Their view of deterrence is more or less along the line of preemption. And I've had this discussion with colleagues that basically, preemption means that this wouldn't preclude the PLA from using an ASAT weapon to probably stop to basically discourage an adversary from, starting a larger conflict. Remember, Sun Tzu is all about, fighting a war without winning. And if you can keep a battle short and quick, that's a good thing. What's a good way of keeping a battle short and quick, say in the Pacific or the South China Sea? Well, disable an adversary's ability for command and control and reconnaissance and navigation. And how would you do that? An ASAT, or either kinetic, cyber, soft kill, or a combination. So their idea of deterrence is we don't preclude the use of these types of weapons or attack, with the U.S. basically, or the Western saying, oh, well, if we make it horrible enough, we won't do it. So I think we got to sit down and rethink, our approach to deterrence, and such. And again, that's a little bit above my pay grade, but that's kind of the baseline of how we have to approach going into any talks about deterrence.
I would also add that the keeping track of the dual use capabilities it's coming on us already. The next Chinese unmanned moon probe, Chang'e 7, in 2024, will take to the moon a very small moon hopper. This is a small device that they're going to use to try to see into the very dark reaches of moon craters that might have water ice. Now, the moon hopper can be considered like a small unmanned aerial vehicle on Earth. It can be used to take pictures, or it can be used to drop grenades on your head. So from that immediate point, China is potentially bringing dual-use artillery to the moon. So we simply have to pay very close attention to these developments.
And sorry, we'll have to close out there because we're hitting the hour. But thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, from defense systems, economic conquest, political and psychological warfare. We've really covered a lot of this space. We've had a privilege to hear from experts with somewhat different backgrounds, but overlapping in their ability to enrich this conversation, which we wanted to convene for the center. And just before we say goodbye to them, I have some brief announcements. Next week, Wednesday, April the 21st, 1 p.m. Eastern, we will have Artificial Intelligence and the Wars of the Future, featuring former Congressman Joe Sestak and Ken Rapuano, and chaired by my colleague John Rosamondo. We are thankful for your viewership today. Remember, the Center's important work is only possible through your generous support. If you do enjoy these weekly programs as much as I do, please go to securefreedom.org, click on the big red donate button in the upper right corner where you can make an instant contribution by credit card and get more information about other methods of giving. With that, I thank our guests, Michael Lissner and Rick Fisher. We'll see everyone here next week at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, folks.